Yesterday, I participated in the Chatham House Conference, Security and Defense Conference 2024, and I will share with you some key insights from that event. It was quite a big event. It was not an academic conference, it was a conference for experts, policy practitioners, diplomats, civil servants, military personnel, and there were some academics too, but the main speakers, all the speakers, almost all the speakers were from the kind of policy and think tank world. So I think it was interesting in a way that this conference took place very only a few days after the Munich Security Conference, and I think it reflected the general kind of mood of that Munich conference, and I think it is kind of indicative of where the thinking in Europe goes in terms of security and defense in 2024. So I will share some insights from this conference in no particular order. This is my subjective list of things that I wanted to mention and address and perhaps challenge in some cases. So let's get to the point. So one thing, I'll just be saying some of the things that were mentioned there. I will not be saying who said them because it's largely irrelevant. In general, there was a general consensus, and that's the kind of overarching theme that the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing war in Ukraine is the most important security threat to Europe. At the outset of this conference, the idea was that different conflicts would be discussed, and Israel and Palestine was also on the agenda, but it really wasn't about that. It really focused on Russia and Ukraine. So one thing that was said was about volume in terms of military buildup and support for Ukraine, but also developing military capabilities for European states. In the past, we would talk about quality over quantity. We would talk about new advancements in military technology, and that's still relevant. But one point that was emphasized over and over again is that Europeans and Americans, but the conference was primarily focused on Europe, Europeans really need to start producing more munitions and start producing more hardware. Volume still is the king. The question of peace negotiations with Russia was also raised, and a general consensus seems to have been that bringing Russia to a negotiating table is inconceivable at this point in time. Right? It's futile to hope that either Ukraine or Russia will anytime soon be ready to sit at the negotiating table. One interesting point that was made was that Russian defeat and Ukrainian victory is the only feasible way out of this conflict, and this was the point that was being repeated over and over again, that Russia has to be defeated and Ukraine has to win this war, although the participants were much less clear about what it means in practice for Ukraine to win the war. One interesting point that was made was that we like to say that Russia miscalculated in 2022 when it launched its full-scale invasion, that it was a mistake for Russia. And that's correct. That's right. It was not a wise move on part of Russia. But the point that was being made was that Europeans also seem to have miscalculated Russian intentions, beginning in 2007, when Putin delivered his infamous speech at the Munich Security Conference, when he presented himself as a kind of very assertive, if not a little bit aggressive political leader who in a way kind of challenged and threatened the West. And then later in 2014, when the conflict broke out in Ukraine and Russia annexed Crimea, the European response was quite weak. And then when Russia stirred conflict in Donbass, and then when Russia got involved in the war in Syria. So all those times, Europeans kind of, well, maybe they haven't exactly been looking the other way, but they did not take a decisive action. So the point was made that Europe also miscalculated, and that there is no more room for miscalculations when it comes to Russia. One point that was being made is that Putin has not been receiving sufficient pushback for his atrocities abroad, but also towards the way he is treating his domestic opposition. One issue that was being raised is the sense of urgency in Western societies, and the point that was being made is that there is insufficient sense of urgency on the part of European societies. It's not to mention the kind of non-Western societies, right? The so-called global South, where many of those countries actually side with Russia or remain indifferent to the conflict. But also in the West, there is a lack of urgency, which is a problem from the perspective of the participants. I asked the delegates about Global South and whether there is a scope to bring countries such as kind of South American countries, African countries, or countries like India closer to the kind of Western vision of seeing Russia and its invasion of Ukraine. And the response from the speakers was that this is not very likely because those countries now have their own voice, they have their own judgment, and in fact European countries have to be careful when making those other countries choose between kind of Russia and the West, between two different systems, because they don't want to be put in that position. But another point that was being made with regards to the so-called Global South is that countries often like to align with themselves with winners. And also it's a matter of perceptions. And if so, if those countries are not aligning themselves against Russia and with the West and Europe, that also tells us something about perceptions, about who is winning the war and who's not winning the war. A point was being made about Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran as a kind of new axis of evil. And the point was being emphasized that those countries are cooperating very closely, and so Western countries have to step up their own cooperation. They have to get the act together because those four countries, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, they represent a significant challenge. One point that was being made, and I didn't have a chance to challenge it because there wasn't sufficient time, but I will do it here. Someone said that some threats are difficult to define geographically, like cyber threats, hybrid threats, or misinformation. And to me, that sounds like a kind of narrative that was very popular in the 1990s and perhaps also 2000s in the context of globalization, when I've been teaching security studies for a long time, and that's something that we would talk a lot about. That was something that all textbooks would talk about, that there are those kind of traditional threats, the geopolitical threats, the wars, which are kind of traditional, if not outdated threats, and then there are those new non-traditional threats, which are difficult to define, which are difficult to define in terms of kind of definition, but also geography, where they originate from. They are dispersed, the boundaries are blurred, etc., etc. Right? So what I would say is today it is much more a straightforward case. Today is not the 1990s. Today we largely know where those non-traditional threats come from. Misinformation, cyber threats, kind of hybrid warfare. Where do they come from? Right? Who is behind those threats? I mean, it's not rocket science. It's not a secret, right? We know who produces misinformation. We know who produces cyber threats. Which countries. So it's really not that much of a mystery. In the audience, there was a representative of the Ukrainian parliament, and there was an interesting exchange between her and a member of British military forces who was among the speakers. And he emphasized the fact that the West is committed to helping Ukraine, but ultimately it is up to Ukraine to decide on how far they want to go, how long they want to fight. And it is a kind of Ukrainian war, and Ukrainians have to decide. So the member of the Ukrainian parliament kind of pushed back on that idea, and she emphasized that from the Russian perspective, at least, this is not a war against Ukraine. This is war against the West. So it is in fact a misperception in the West to think that it's only between Russia and Ukraine, when Russia in fact sees this as a conflict against the West. Russia arguably thinks that it is in fact fighting NATO countries and Western countries who are heavily committed to support Ukraine. And so she called upon Western countries to take greater responsibility for Ukrainian victory, right? To, for example, to offer Ukraine a clear pathway towards NATO membership. And the response of that speaker, the representative of the British military forces, was that, well, one has to be careful with that kind of argument, because if this is in fact also a war which involves Western countries, which Western countries are in a way part of, then the Western countries also have or should have a voice, should have a say as to when to begin negotiations and when to stop fighting, right? And they should be the stakeholders who also have a say to say, okay, it's time now to start negotiations with Russia. And then he kind of emphasized that that the West is behind Ukraine and is committed to support Ukraine. In that context, American foreign policy came up a few times, and the prospect of Donald Trump returning to the White House. And again, the kind of the overarching consensus among the speakers there was that we don't know what will happen in Washington, and we cannot control American politics. We have no control over it, and there is no point for us Europeans to go into kind of trying to predict and analyze what might happen. What Europeans should focus on is something that they do have control over, and that is developing European capabilities, right? Developing European security presence. So that's something that Europe should focus on. Finally, there was also a keynote speech by the head of the British Armed Forces, who is here on this picture, and he sought to reassure the audience that, well, at least Britain, but he was in fact talking about the whole NATO, is safe, that we are not on the cusp of war with Russia. And in that kind of, he was addressing recent reports by different intelligence services of European countries and politicians making statements saying things like, we may have 2 or 3 years before Russia makes a move against NATO. So he disagreed with that. He said we are not on a cusp of war with Russia. He emphasized the strength of NATO. He said NATO is becoming stronger all the time. He also said that Putin does not want conflict with NATO, and Russia cannot afford a conflict with NATO because Russia would lose very quickly. He said that this doesn't mean that Russia is not dangerous, because Russia is both more dangerous and less capable. And perhaps even the less capable Russia is, the more dangerous it becomes. It's unpredictable. So it's not to minimize the unpredictability and danger coming from Russia, but he emphasized the point that Russia is in no position to seriously threaten NATO. So those are some of the main points. Feel free to let me know what you think about them. It was an enjoyable experience, and yeah, I look forward to report back to you on some more events in the near future.